Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 57 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have won 4-3 in overtime. The Sharks have been involved in many overtime games over their past, month or so, but many of those have been losses. So it's nice to see the Sharks finally come out on top in one of those types of matchups. Not only do they find themselves in the winning column of an overtime game for the first time in a while, but they also find themselves generally into the winning column for the first time in a decent bit. Obviously, there was that victory against the Seattle Kraken, but that one kind of felt a bit hollow because I felt as though the Sharks didn't necessarily look very good in that game. But here tonight, they were rather competitive with a Los Angeles Kings team that you must admit is looking quite solid thus far this season. Second place in the Pacific Division, came into tonight with 71 points on the season, which was a large chunk ahead of the San Jose Sharks, and the Kings have also been a pretty solid shutdown defensive team thus far this year. Now, of course, the Kings were coming into this game without Victor Arvidsson and in particular without Drew Doughty on the back end, so we should not necessarily have been expecting some sort of insane performance from the Kings, but still the Sharks managed a large amount of shots, finally managed to go above 30 shots for like the first time in a million years, it just so seems like. So a nice confidence boosting game for the San Jose Sharks. Will this really bring them anywhere in terms of the rest of this season? It's probably too little too late, but still good to see the Sharks finally get a win to boost some morale of this team. This one starts off pretty well for the San Jose Sharks. Just a few minutes in, they get one of many power plays this game, and it would be Brent Burns off of a very nice pass from the returning Erik Karlsson to make it 1-0 San Jose. However, that lead would not last. The Kings would respond with 2 goals within 8 seconds of each other to immediately turn a 1-0 Sharks lead into a 2-1 Los Angeles Kings lead. And I'll mention these 2 goals a bit later on when I get to talking about the goaltender, but they were not particularly good to be let in. And that would be the final score at the end of the first period. Going into the second period, though, the Sharks really picked things up. It was a pretty evenly played first period, certainly a lot of open ice. I would say both teams getting a lot of very good chances. But in the second period, it seemed to tilt a bit more towards the San Jose Sharks side, though it would actually be the Kings getting the first goal of the second period, shorthanded from Moore to make it 3-1 Los Angeles. And at this point, you may have thought that the Sharks were kind of out of it, especially as of late the Sharks have been mustering up 0 offense. And so 3 goals to score to not only tie this game, but then 4 goals to actually win it. That would have seemed like a very tall mountain to climb, but the Sharks managed to do that, and it started with a second power play goal of the game on the very same power play that the Kings scored shorthanded on. Nick Bonino would cut the lead in half to make it 3-2 Los Angeles, and that would be the score at the end of 2 periods. In the third period, the ice would end up tilting towards the Los Angeles Kings side, but having said that, the Sharks would actually score the game-tying goal very, very early on in the third period from Barabanov off of a very nice pass, once again from Erik Karlsson, to tie it up at 3. There were some really close calls in the last couple of minutes of this game. There was a massive scramble in the Sharks' crease where we had no idea where the puck was, and you were just kind of praying that it wouldn't end up going past the goal line, and it didn't. But we would eventually head to overtime, where the Sharks had the majority of the possession for the pretty short overtime period that they ended up playing, and Tomas Hertl scored on a wraparound goal. Tomas Hertl is known for his wraparounds and known for missing on his wraparounds. It seems as though at least once or twice every single game he tries this type of move, and it never actually works, but for once he manages to bury it. I really thought I was dreaming. I had to pinch myself, and I didn't wake up. Not only was it a Sharks win, but a Sharks win off of a Hertl wraparound goal. Maybe we'll even find a unicorn tomorrow. On to the players to talk about. We had a couple of returning faces to the lineup here tonight, the first of which was Jonathan Dahlen, and is immediately put back onto this first line. Obviously, prior to his injury, he was kind of struggling a bit, was in the Bob Booner doghouse, and ended up on the 4th line for a couple of games, then got injured, missed about a week, but is back here tonight, is on the first line, and it didn't really work out. In fact, this was probably the Sharks' least effective line, or at least worst line. I can't really say least effective because they did get a couple of chances, you can say, but most of the time they found themselves in the defending zone, having to defend against an onslaught of Kings forwards, and so it was a bit of an issue here tonight. Was it Jonathan Dahlen's fault particularly? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but would he likely end up being the scapegoat going into tomorrow's game unless Bob Booner decides to not change the lineup because the Sharks won? I suspect Dahlen would be the one looking at some sort of demotion. On the other hand, the second line of Barabanov, Hurdle, and Balcers, which was so bad for the San Jose Sharks in their previous game, completely did a 180 here tonight and was the Sharks' far and away best line. Balcers wasn't super noticeable near the end of the game, but did have a couple of solid chances early on, hit a post, came very so close to scoring in that particular area. Tomas Hertl was just absolutely dominant, I must say, on the offensive side of things. He only scored that goal in the wraparound in the overtime. However, he probably could have had a couple more just in regulation play if he had just a bit more puck luck. Obviously, he had gone on a pretty sizable, at least for him, goalless streak and even pointless streak, so it's nice to see him be able to break out of that, and maybe that'll help him down the stretch. And when it comes to Barabanov, also a pretty solid game for himself. Scored that game-tying goal that brought it to 3-3 early in the third period, and it was a very nice goal. I mentioned the pass earlier from Erik Karlsson, but you have to be able to get the perfect tip on that, and that's exactly what Barabanov managed to do. Great second line for the Sharks here tonight. On to the third line, which is usually a massive liability for the San Jose Sharks, especially since this is the classic Cogliano, Bonino, Nieto third line. But for the first time, in ever, it seems, once in a blue moon type of thing, the broken clock is right twice a day, any type of cliche you want to use. This third line actually didn't look all that bad. I wouldn't say that they were dominant offensively, though Bonino did score a power play goal, but they were not hemmed into their own zone. And this is, the Caterpillars type progress that we're kind of hoping for from this line. I'm not expecting them to suddenly become this offensive force. They were never expected to be an offensive force. Their job was always to limit goals against. They haven't been doing that, but they finally got to it this game, which was nice to see. On the fourth line, we had Gadjevich, Reedy, and Gregor. Not a particularly noticeable fourth line here tonight. I know Reedy drew a penalty, which I guess was nice to see, but otherwise there really wasn't much going on with these three players. On the defensive side of things, we also had a couple of returning faces, though. At first, we have this first pairing of Burns and Middleton. Middleton, interesting player because he's been in the news as of late, in the trade rumors, as the trade deadline approaches in just about a week and a half. Middleton seems to be a potential option as a bottom pairing defenseman, but with the ability to flex into the top four if there is an injury for a lot of these top tier playoff teams. And so there were a lot of scouts at tonight's game, likely most of them taking a look at Jacob Middleton's game, and well, he probably didn't impress all that much. Paired with Brent Burns here tonight, as he has been over these past few games, he did not end up returning on to the pairing with Erik Karlsson, who he was with prior to the injury to Erik Karlsson a few weeks ago, and Middleton, I guess, struggled because of that. This was not a particularly strong pairing for the San Jose Sharks. Like their first line, this pairing was the one that was hemmed into their own zone many of their shifts when the Los Angeles Kings were on the offensive side of things. Yes, like with the first line, it's a situation where they're facing off against the top players of the Kings. Andrei Kopitar very much found himself frequently against Burns and Middleton, but still, just because that is the case, you still want your defensive pairing to actually play some more so in the offensive zone, and they really didn't get much time there. On the other hand, we had an entirely new second pairing for the San Jose Sharks. Both Karlsson and Megna returned to the lineup here tonight, and Erik Karlsson in particular. Megna, you did your part, I guess, but we have to talk about Erik Karlsson. An absolutely outstanding game for Karlsson here tonight. Just on the, at least, very least on the offensive side of things. Was his defensive game up to snuff? It wasn't terrible. It wasn't great. It was pretty average, I would say, but on the offensive side of things, things just could not have gone that much better for Karlsson. Had a couple of fantastic primary assists, like I mentioned, on the Burns goal, on the Barabanov goal, had some nice moves in the overtime early on his early shifts, had some decent passes as well in other moments. There was this one particular play, I believe it was in the third period, where Karlsson feeds a nice pass to Hertl, but then it goes back to Karlsson, and it was just generally a nice attempt that ended up not being a shot on net, if I'm not mistaken, but came very, very close. And just generally, the difference between the Sharks without Karlsson and the Sharks with Karlsson is just completely night and day, because before the Erik Karlsson injury, were the Sharks a playoff team? Probably not, but they were in an actual decent position to make a run, and it was when Karlsson went down with an injury where the Sharks just went almost winless over the stretch of games where he was out there. It really goes to show just how important Erik Karlsson has been, especially with the decline of Brent Burns. A couple of years ago, for instance, the 18-19 season when Erik Karlsson went down with his injury, then the Sharks didn't necessarily have that much of regression. Obviously, the Sharks did get noticeably worse, but they were still an above 500 team. They were still definitely a winning team, one of the better teams in the league. Now, obviously, they weren't one of the better teams in the league before Karlsson's injury, but it was a steep drop-off where they suddenly became like one of the bottom 3 to 5 teams. And so with Karlsson back in the lineup, suddenly the Sharks look like a fun team to watch again. And then there's the final pairing of Vlasic and Miloš. Thank God for Marc-Edouard Vlasic that Karlsson ends up returning, because now the Sharks can run a top 4 that does not include Vlasic. Vlasic ends up getting about 13.5 minutes here tonight, is extremely sheltered, and he looks good enough in those sheltered minutes along with Nick Miloš. Now, would I have rather seen Ryan Merkley get in over a player like Miloš? Absolutely. I think Merkley would also very much excel in a sheltered role like Miloš got here tonight, and I think it would be significantly better for the Sharks for Merkley to get ice time compared to Miloš, because no offense to him, Merkley's ceiling as a player is about 50 times higher, but whatever. I mean, Bob Booner is going to Bob Booner. He's going to make these weird decisions, and I can't really do anything to affect those things. And finally, there is the goaltending. Zach Sawchenko started off extremely shaky in this one. Like I mentioned earlier, those 2 goals that the Sharks did let in, they were not good. The first one is a shot from pretty far out that goes off of the glove of Sawchenko for an easy rebound tap in for the Los Angeles Kings. That was one he definitely should have been able to just catch. And then just 8 seconds later, a very simple play by Athanasiou enters the zone, takes a shot from pretty far out that just fools Sawchenko, and it really looked like this was going to end up being a rout. Sawchenko was going to let in a couple more shaky type of goals. Stalock would come in, the Sharks would be trailing like 4-1, and they'd end up losing the game something like 7-2. But credit where credit is due, while Sawchenko's next couple of saves after that still looked a bit kind of shaky, he really did bring it back. He only let in 1 more goal for the rest of the game. That was the Trevor Moore one, which was essentially a 2-on-0 as the Sharks just completely got lost in their shorthanded defense. But Sawchenko made a good chunk of saves, a very nice rebound performance for himself. Did not look like, people having the PTSD of Martin Jones, who would let in a couple of early goals and then just completely fall off a cliff. Sawchenko did not do that. That was nice to see and bodes well for his future, whether that is with the San Jose Sharks, whether that is with the San Jose Barracuda. It's good to see he has the mental capacity to stay calm. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on none other than the Los Angeles Kings a second time. The Sharks have had a decent amount of success against a pretty strong Los Angeles Kings team this season. Obviously, prior to this game was a 6-2 Sharks victory in which Timo Meier scored 5 goals. And so we'll see if the Sharks can continue their, I guess, dominance, you could say, over the Los Angeles Kings. Class dismissed.